Hello dreamers. Tonight, we venture into one of gaming's most disturbing religious cults, a fanatical organization that has lurked beneath the fog of Silent Hill for centuries. This is the story of the Order, a cult that believes paradise can only be born from suffering, that God herself feeds on hatred and pain, and that the path to salvation is paved with the ashes of burned children and the screams of the dying. We will explore every twisted belief, every horrific ritual, and every dark secret of this doomsday cult that has shaped the nightmares of Silent Hill across multiple games. From the immolation of innocent children to the drug trafficking that funded their operations, from the sacred symbols carved in human flesh to the underground orphanages where they molded killers, we will examine the complete history of the Order and understand why they truly believed that only through absolute agony could humanity be saved. Take a moment before we begin to subscribe if you haven't already. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference and allows me to continue guiding you to restful sleep night after night. Now, settle into your pillows, close your eyes, and let's begin our journey into the twisted faith of Silent Hill's most dangerous believers. Before the fog consumed Silent Hill, before European settlers ever set foot on American soil, the land surrounding Toluca Lake belonged to indigenous peoples who recognized something fundamentally different about this place. They called it the place of the silenced spirits, a name that spoke to an ancient understanding of the region's supernatural nature. The native inhabitants knew that the boundary between worlds grew thin here, that reality itself seemed more fluid along these shores. Archaeological evidence suggests the presence of the Toluca tribe, among others, who inhabited the area for centuries before European contact. These tribes performed elaborate ceremonies at sites they considered sacred, locations where they believed they could commune with ancestors and entities from beyond the mortal realm. Central to their spiritual practices was worship of a deity they called the Raven, sometimes referred to as Quequaxawe in their language. This entity demanded reverence, and according to oral traditions that survived in fragmentary form, required blood offerings to maintain the balance between worlds. The natives built ceremonial sites throughout the region, including areas that would later be known as the Devil's Pit, and the location of what Europeans would call the Mother Stone, or Nakihona in the native tongue. This massive stone formation, in what would become the Silent Hill Woods, served as a focal point for rituals intended to communicate with deceased ancestors, though whether these communications actually occurred remains a matter of speculation and belief rather than documented fact. The 17th century brought catastrophic change. European settlers arrived with their own religious convictions, their own understanding of the divine, and an absolute certainty that the land was theirs for the taking. What followed was a pattern repeated across the Americas: displacement, violence, and the gradual erasure of the indigenous population. By the mid-1600s, the native peoples had been driven from their ancestral lands through a combination of disease, conflict, and systematic removal. The Europeans claimed the territory, renamed it, and began building their own communities. But something persisted in the land itself. Whether it was the lingering spiritual energy the natives had recognized, the accumulated suffering of those who died during the displacement, or something that had existed there since time immemorial, the new settlers quickly discovered that this place was not like other colonial holdings. In 1692, an event occurred that would become foundational to what would eventually be known as the Order. A woman named Jennifer Carroll was accused of witchcraft by the puritanical residents of the fledgling settlement. The accusations followed familiar patterns: unexplained illnesses, strange occurrences, perhaps nothing more than the paranoia and religious fervor that gripped many colonial communities during that era. Jennifer was bound, tried, and burned at the stake in what the colonists believed was a righteous act of faith. Her screams as the flames consumed her echoed across the settlement, and witnesses reported that she cursed the town with her dying breath, promising that her suffering would not be forgotten. What the settlers did not expect was what came after. Rather than being condemned as a witch, Jennifer Carroll would eventually be venerated as a saint by the religious movement that would grow from the town's darkest impulses. This transformation from executed witch to sacred martyr speaks to the fundamental inversion of values that would characterize the Order's theology. In their eyes, Jennifer's suffering in the flames did not condemn her, but rather sanctified her. Her pain became holy, her death a sacred act that brought her closer to the divine truth they sought. Over the following decades, the settlement that would become Silent Hill grew slowly. The land proved difficult to cultivate. The isolation bred suspicion and strange beliefs, and an unusually high number of unexplained deaths plagued the community. Settlers reported visions, heard voices in the fog that frequently rolled in from Toluca Lake, and experienced phenomena that defied rational explanation. Some attributed these experiences to the lingering influence of the native spirits, angry at being displaced. Others believed the land itself was cursed. A few began to see these experiences not as curses, but as revelations, as glimpses of a deeper reality that most people were too blind to perceive. By the early 1700s, a small group within the community began synthesizing elements of the native beliefs they had learned about through artifacts, fragmentary accounts, with their own Christian background, particularly focusing on apocalyptic scripture and the concept of redemptive suffering. They incorporated symbols they found carved on ancient stones, modified rituals they pieced together from indigenous ceremonial objects discovered in the Devil's Pit, and developed an entirely new theological framework. This synthesis created something neither purely Christian nor purely based on native traditions, but rather a hybrid faith that drew power from both sources while belonging fully to neither. The group remained small and secretive through the 1700s. They had learned from Jennifer Carroll's fate that openly practicing beliefs that diverged from accepted Christianity invited persecution. So they met in hidden locations, passed their teachings through careful oral tradition to trusted initiates, and slowly expanded their influence within the community. They called themselves the faithful, the awakened, the chosen ones who understood the true nature of God and reality. But they did not yet have a formal name or structure. That would come later, when Silent Hill transformed from an isolated colonial settlement into something very different. The turning point came in the 1800s when Silent Hill began to develop as a resort destination. Toluca Lake's natural beauty and the region's misty, atmospheric qualities attracted tourists seeking escape from urban life. With tourism came money, and with money came opportunity. The secretive religious group saw their chance to expand beyond the shadows. Around 1900, they formally organized themselves into what they called simply the Order, establishing a structured hierarchy and beginning to actively recruit new members. Most residents of Silent Hill despised the cult, recognizing their beliefs as heretical and their practices as disturbing. But the Order had learned patience over 2 centuries of secrecy. They would not announce themselves publicly or attempt to forcibly convert the town. Instead, they would infiltrate gradually, securing positions of influence while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Their first major foothold came through Alchemilla Hospital. By placing members in positions within the medical establishment, the Order gained access to pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and most importantly, the ability to conceal their activities behind the legitimacy of healthcare. Doctors affiliated with the cult could forge death certificates, falsify autopsy reports, and ensure that questions about mysterious deaths or disappearances never received thorough investigation. The hospital became not just a medical facility, but a sanctuary where the Order could conduct rituals, store sacred objects, and keep their most precious asset hidden from the world. The second major institution they infiltrated was the Wish House Orphanage, operated under the charitable facade of the Silent Hill Smile Support Society. To the outside world, Wish House appeared to be a noble endeavor, providing care for poor and homeless children who had nowhere else to go. In reality, it served as an indoctrination center where the Order could raise children from infancy in their beliefs, shaping vulnerable minds into future cultists who knew no other worldview. The children at Wish House endured psychological manipulation, physical abuse, disguised as discipline, and constant exposure to the Order's apocalyptic theology. They were taught that suffering was holy, that pain brought one closer to God, and that the outside world was corrupt and destined for cleansing fire. To fund their expansion and maintain their growing influence, the Order turned to the land itself, discovering a solution in a plant that grew naturally along the shores of Toluca Lake and in marshy areas throughout the region. The plant was called White Claudia, a perennial herb with oblong leaves and white blossoms that had been used in native ceremonies for its hallucinogenic properties. The seeds contained powerful psychoactive compounds that, when properly processed, could induce vivid visions and altered states of consciousness. For the Order, White Claudia represented both a sacrament and a commodity. The cult established laboratories, likely within Alchemilla Hospital itself, where they refined White Claudia seeds into a drug they called PTV. The name itself has been debated by investigators, but evidence suggests it may have been inspired by the band Psychic TV, whose occult themes aligned with the Order's interests. PTV appeared as either a white powder or a red liquid, depending on the processing method, and its effects were profound. Users reported intense hallucinations, temporal distortions, and the sensation of perceiving other dimensions or realities. Some claim to see angels, demons, or glimpses of what the order called the Otherworld. Within the cult, PTV served as a tool for spiritual awakening. Initiates consumed it during rituals to achieve what they believed was communion with their God. The drug stripped away the barriers of mundane perception, allowing cultists to experience visions they interpreted as divine revelation. But the order recognized that PTV had another, more practical value. Tourists visiting Silent Hill represented a population eager for new experiences, seeking thrills or escape from their ordinary lives. The Order's network, working through dealers like Dr. Michael Kaufman and his associate Norman Young, sold PTV on the black market to these visitors. The drug trade generated substantial income that funded the cult's operations, while also serving their spiritual purposes. The influence of PTV extended beyond simple drug trafficking. Evidence suggests the order deliberately targeted specific individuals with the drug, using it to manipulate, blackmail, or destroy those who opposed their interests. Lisa Garland, a nurse at Alchemilla Hospital, became addicted to PTV and was subsequently blackmailed by Kaufman into providing illegal services for the cult, including tending to their most carefully guarded secret in the hospital's basement. The addiction broke her completely, reducing a caring medical professional to someone willing to do anything for her next dose. The drug trade inevitably attracted attention from law enforcement. An anti-drug mayor of Silent Hill and a narcotics officer named Gucci began investigating the PTV network in the years leading up to the first game's events. Both men died under highly suspicious circumstances, officially ruled as sudden heart failure of unknown origin. The Order had learned that loose ends must be eliminated, and they possessed both the medical access through Alchemilla Hospital to forge death certificates and possibly the supernatural means to kill in ways that appeared natural. At the heart of the Order's theology lay an inversion of traditional creation mythology that fundamentally shaped everything they believed and every atrocity they committed. Most religions teach that God created humanity, but the Order believed the opposite. According to their scriptures and sacred texts, humanity created God through the collective weight of suffering, hatred, and despair. This inverted cosmology provided the theological justification for every act of cruelty, every ritual sacrifice, and every deliberate infliction of pain that characterized the cult's practices. The Order's creation myth described a primordial time before linear time existed, when humanity was immortal but cursed with eternal consciousness of their suffering. These immortal humans endured endless pain, knowing no relief, no death, no escape from their agony. In this state of perpetual torment, humanity cried out for salvation. The prayers took different forms. A man prayed to the sun for deliverance from suffering. A woman prayed for joy, for some experience of happiness amid the unrelenting misery. These prayers, repeated across millennia by countless suffering souls, accumulated power. The collective anguish and desperate pleading of humanity eventually achieved critical mass, and from this concentrated suffering, God was born. This God, according to the Order's beliefs, was female and took the form of a compassionate mother who heard the cries of her creators and sought to help them. She accomplished two great acts of mercy. First, she stripped humanity of immortality, granting them the gift of death so they could finally escape their suffering through mortality. Second, she created linear time, allowing humans to experience past, present, and future rather than existing in an eternal, unchanging state of awareness of their pain. These were considered acts of profound love, the mother caring for her children by giving them what they most needed. But the creation of mortality and time required tremendous power, and God exhausted herself in the process. Having given everything to save humanity from their primordial suffering, she died or perhaps fell into a dormant state. Before her power failed completely, she made a promise to her faithful followers. She vowed that one day, when the conditions were right and her worshippers properly prepared the way, she would return to the world. Upon her return, she would complete the work she had begun. She would create paradise, a realm free from all suffering, where the faithful could exist in eternal peace and joy. This return, however, came with a catastrophic requirement. The Order believed that when God returned, she would cleanse the world with fire, bringing about an apocalypse that would destroy all of corrupt, sinful humanity. Only those who remained faithful to her, who truly understood her nature and had prepared themselves spiritually, would survive this purification. They would be lifted up to paradise while the rest of humanity burned in divine judgment. The apocalypse was not something to be feared, but rather anticipated eagerly as the fulfillment of God's promise and the ultimate reward for the suffering the faithful endured in her service. The Order drew symbols and theological concepts from multiple religious traditions to flesh out their cosmology. They venerated sacred objects and artifacts associated with the ancient native worship of the raven deity, believing this entity and their god were the same being perceived through different cultural lenses. They incorporated Christian imagery, particularly from apocalyptic texts like Revelation, reinterpreting passages about the end times through their inverted theological framework. They adopted elements of occultism, demon summoning, and black magic, viewing these not as separate from their religion, but as practical tools for accessing the spiritual power necessary to bring about God's return. The Order developed an elaborate demonology and angelology. They believed in entities called Valtiel, described as an angel who turned the wheels of fate and served as an intermediary between the human world and the divine realm. Valtiel appeared in their sacred art as a figure shrouded in blood-red robes, its face hidden, its purpose inscrutable, yet essential to the cosmic machinery that would eventually birth God back into the world. Another entity, the incubus, bore striking resemblance to the figure of Baphomet, often associated with satanic worship. The Order did not see this resemblance as contradictory, but rather as evidence that what others called the devil was simply another face of their God, another manifestation of the divine force they served. This theological ambiguity extended to the Order's entire moral framework. They explicitly rejected the concepts of good and evil as meaningless human constructs. Instead, They understood the universe in terms of chaos and order. Chaos represented the natural state of suffering, the primordial condition from which God was born. Order represented structure, discipline, and the hierarchical systems necessary to channel suffering toward productive spiritual ends. By this reasoning, inflicting pain on others was not evil, but rather maintaining proper order, creating the suffering that would feed and eventually resurrect their God. The order believed God required specific conditions to return to the world. Most critically, she needed to be born through a human vessel, a woman or girl with extraordinary psychic abilities who could carry the divine essence in her womb, like a pregnancy. This vessel would need to experience tremendous suffering to properly incubate God, as the deity fed on and was strengthened by pain, hatred, and despair. The more anguish the vessel endured, the more powerful God would be upon her birth. For this reason, the Order spent decades searching for the perfect vessel, attempting the birthing ritual with various young women, most of whom died during the process because their psychic abilities were insufficient to withstand the divine presence growing within them. The theology also held that different forms of suffering produced different types of divine power. Pain inflicted through fire, for example, held particular potency, which explained the Order's frequent use of immolation in their rituals. The burning of Jennifer Carroll in 1692 became a template for later sacrifices. Water drowning, suffocation, and other methods of ritual killing each had their place in the cult's practices, with specific theological justifications for when each method should be employed. The Order was nothing if not systematic in their cruelty, turning torture and murder into sacred art forms with elaborate rules and scriptural precedents. Perhaps most disturbing was the Order's belief that paradise itself would only truly be paradise if God was born from the right kind of suffering. There was disagreement within the cult about this point, leading to the formation of different sects with varying interpretations. Some believed God needed to be born from pain to make her sympathetic to human suffering, creating a deity who understood anguish intimately because she had experienced it in the vessel's body. Others argued that God needed to be born from pure hatred, as this would create a God powerful enough to completely destroy the corrupt world and remake it properly. These theological disputes would shape the Order's actions across multiple decades and ultimately lead to internal conflicts that contributed to the cult's eventual dissolution. The Order was not a monolithic organization, but rather a collection of sects, each with its own interpretation of the core theology, its own methods for achieving God's return, and its own leadership structure. 4 major sects dominated the cult's history, though evidence suggests numerous smaller groups and splinter factions existed throughout the organization's existence. These sects sometimes cooperated toward common goals, but also competed for influence and resources, viewing each other's theological interpretations as flawed or insufficient. The sect of the Holy Woman represented the oldest and most influential branch of the Order. Centered around a high priestess, this sect believed that God would be resurrected by impregnating a woman who possessed exceptional psychic powers with the divine essence, essentially making her pregnant with God. The sect initially believed this would happen naturally, that God would return in her own time if the faithful simply maintained their devotion and waited patiently. The high priestess, Dahlia Gillespie, however, grew impatient with this passive approach. She believed humanity had suffered enough already, that the faithful had proven themselves, and that actively hastening God's return was not only acceptable, but necessary. This belief led Dahlia to modify the sect's practices dramatically. Rather than waiting for God to choose her vessel, Dahlia decided to force the issue by using her own daughter, Alessa, who had been born with extraordinary psychic abilities. The immolation ritual Dahlia conducted in 1987 became the defining act of the sect of the Holy Woman, establishing a new precedent that suffering must be actively inflicted rather than passively endured. After Dahlia's death in the events of the first game, the sect went through approximately 10 years of inactivity and disorganization. The revival of the sect of the Holy Woman came through the efforts of Vincent Smith and Claudia Wolf. Vincent provided financial resources and organizational expertise, restructuring the sect to be more sustainable and systematic. The number of adherents increased rapidly under Vincent's management, and Claudia Wolf assumed the role of high priestess. However, Claudia brought her own theological interpretation to the position. Having suffered severe physical abuse from her father, Leonard Wolf, throughout her childhood, Claudia believed that a God born from pain and suffering would be more sympathetic and understanding. She modified the sect's approach to focus on generating hatred in the vessel rather than simple pain, believing this would create a more compassionate deity who truly understood human suffering. Vincent Smith himself represented a more cynical element within the sect. Evidence suggests he did not fully believe the theology, but saw the order as a means to accumulate power and wealth. His cynicism created tension with Claudia's fanatical devotion, ultimately leading to his death at her hands. Notable members of the sect of the Holy Woman included Dahlia Gillespie, Claudia Wolf, Vincent Smith, and Leonard Wolf. The sect of the Holy Mother took a different approach to achieving God's return. Rather than impregnating a human vessel, this sect believed that God, whom they called the Holy Mother, would descend into a sacred object through the agency of a conjurer, a person specially trained and spiritually prepared to serve as a channel for divine power. The sect operated the Wish House Orphanage, using it as a recruiting ground where they identified children with potential psychic abilities and subjected them to years of indoctrination and training. The sect venerated the Mother Stone, a massive rock formation in the Silent Hill woods that the native Toluca tribe had called Nakihona. They believed this stone was sacred, imbued with spiritual power from centuries of native ceremonies, and that it could serve as the vessel into which God would descend if the proper ritual was performed by a properly prepared conjurer. The sect's practices were somewhat less violent than the sect of the Holy Woman, at least in their theological approach, but the reality at Wish House was horrific. Children endured psychological torment, physical abuse, and systematic brainwashing designed to break their individual wills and reshape them into perfect servants of the order. The sect's most infamous product was Walter Sullivan, an infant abandoned in an apartment in the neighboring community of Ashfield. Walter was brought to Wish House and raised from early childhood in the sect's beliefs. Priests like George Roston and the man known as Jimmy Stone, called the Red Devil, personally oversaw Walter's training. They taught him that he could commune with his mother by completing a ritual called the 21 Sacraments for the descent of the Holy Mother, a ceremony requiring the ritualistic murder of 21 specific victims. Walter believed the apartment where he had been abandoned, room 302, was actually his mother in a spiritual sense, and completing the sacraments would allow him to reunite with her. The sect of the Holy Mother demonstrated a particular cruelty in their treatment of children. Records from Wish House describe systematic abuse designed to break the children's spirits and make them absolutely obedient to the order's will. Children who resisted or showed insufficient faith faced severe punishment. The sect viewed this abuse not as cruelty, but as necessary discipline, spiritual training that would prepare the children for their sacred purposes. Many children raised at Wish House did not survive to adulthood, and those who did bore deep psychological scars that shaped the rest of their lives. Leadership of the sect included George Roston, head of the Holy Mother sect and a priest of the Valtiel sect, indicating that individuals could hold positions in multiple sects simultaneously. Toby Archbold served as a prominent priest in the sect's later years, though he would eventually flee to Mexico in fear of Walter Sullivan's killing spree, only to be hunted down and murdered there as a victim 14 of the 21 Sacraments. The sect effectively ended when Walter killed its remaining leaders, though whether this was intentional destruction or simply Walter following the requirements of his ritual remains unclear. The sect of Valtiel served a unique function within the order's structure, centered around the enigmatic angel Valtiel. This sect acted as intermediaries between the sect of the Holy Woman and the sect of the Holy Mother, which held opposing theological views and competed for dominance within the larger order. Members of the Valtiel sect wore distinctive blood-red robes and focused their worship on Valtiel as the entity closest to God, an executor of divine will who turned the wheels of fate. The sect's leader, Jimmy Stone, earned the nickname the Red Devil, possibly referring to his red robes or to his particularly zealous and perhaps cruel personality. Stone worked to maintain balance between the feuding sects, preventing open conflict while also ensuring that both groups contributed to the ultimate goal of resurrecting God. George Roston served as Stone's right-hand priest and also held position within the Holy Mother sect, embodying the Valtiel sect's role as a bridge between different interpretations of the faith. The theological focus on Valtiel as a being that turns the wheels suggests the sect believed in fate or destiny as a literal mechanism that could be influenced through ritual. They saw Valtiel as the operator of this cosmic machinery, the entity who actually enacted divine will in the physical world. By venerating Valtiel, the sect positioned themselves as crucial facilitators of God's return, neither creating the conditions for rebirth as directly as the other sects attempted, but ensuring that the cosmic machinery functioned properly. Like the Holy Mother sect, the Valtiel sect was effectively destroyed when Walter Sullivan killed both Jimmy Stone and George Roaston during his 21 Sacraments ritual. These murders occurred approximately 10 years before the events of Silent Hill 4, leaving the Valtiel sect leaderless and unable to fulfill its mediating role between the remaining Order factions. The fourth major sect never formally called itself part of the Order, but maintained enough of the core beliefs to be considered a splinter group. In 1853, 4 families departed Silent Hill amid what historical records cryptically describe as a schism in the faith. These families were the Shepherds, the Holloways, the Bartletts, and the Fitches. They traveled along the shores of Toluca Lake and founded a new community they called Shepherd's Glen, seeking to practice their faith away from the main order while living more peaceful, stable lives. However, their departure was not simply accepted by the Order's God. According to the founding family's own records, the deity entered into a pact with them. If each family sacrificed one of their children every 50 years in a specific ritualistic manner, Shepherd's Glen would be spared from the effects of the Otherworld, the nightmarish alternate reality that plagued Silent Hill. The families agreed to these terms, and the pact was sealed in blood and sacred contracts. Each family received a specific method by which they would sacrifice their chosen child. The Shepherd family would sacrifice their children to water, drowning them in Toluca Lake. The Holloway family would sacrifice their children to the noose, hanging them until they suffocated. The Bartlett family would sacrifice their children to earth, burying them alive. The Fitch family would sacrifice their children to the knife, dismembering them. These methods aligned with elemental symbolism important to the Order's cosmology, with each family serving as guardians of a particular aspect of the divine plan. For 150 years, the 4 families maintained the pact. Every 50 years, in September, each family would select one of their children and perform the prescribed sacrifice. The contracts found in the underground chambers beneath Shepherd's Glen Town Hall describe how each family accepted specific duties. The Shepherds served as masters of arms, the Bartletts as executors of law, the Fitches as performers of rites, and the Holloways as keepers of truth. These roles gave each family authority over different aspects of Shepherd's Glen's governance, while also binding them to the terrible obligation of sacrificing their own children. The system created a community built on institutionalized child murder, where parents raised multiple children, knowing that one would eventually be selected for sacrifice. The psychological impact on these families was profound. Parents had to choose between their children, deciding which child would die and which would inherit the family responsibility of selecting the next generation's sacrifice. The chosen child often did not know their fate until the moment of the ritual, though some families told the designated victim beforehand, adding psychological torture to the physical horror of their death. The pact shattered in 2003 when Adam Shepherd, sheriff of Shepherd's Glen and head of the Shepherd family, failed to fulfill his obligation. He had designated his older son Alex as the sacrifice and his younger son Joshua as the heir who would continue the family line. However, Joshua died in a tragic accident, falling and breaking his neck before drowning in Toluca Lake. Unable to bring himself to sacrifice his remaining son, Adam let the deadline pass without performing the ritual. The other three families completed their sacrifices. Mayor Sam Bartlett buried his son Joey alive. Martin Fitch dismembered his daughter Scarlett. Judge Margaret Holloway hanged her daughter Nora. But without the shepherd's sacrifice, the pact was broken. God's wrath descended on Shepherd's Glen between 2003 and 2007. The town slowly succumbed to the Otherworld's effects. Reality warping and twisting, fog rolling in, and monsters appearing in the streets. Judge Holloway, desperate to appease God and save her community, reformed the order in Shepherd's Glen. She began kidnapping citizens, forcing them to convert or face torture and death. The blood of those who refused was collected in massive tanks found in the underground ritual chambers. Holloway believed that by demonstrating renewed faith and perhaps offering additional sacrifices, she could restore the pact and save Shepherd's Glen. She failed. By 2007, when Alex Shepherd returned to his hometown, Shepherd's Glen was nearly as nightmarish as Silent Hill itself. The symbol most closely associated with the order across all its sects was the halo of the sun, a complex geometric design that appeared throughout Silent Hill in ritual spaces, on sacred objects, and even as savvy points in the third game, where Heather Mason's journey brought her repeatedly into contact with the cult's legacy. Understanding the halo of the sun requires examining both its visual design and its deep symbolic meaning within the order's theology. The symbol consists of multiple circular elements arranged in a specific pattern. Two outer circles frame the design, representing the dual concepts of charity, one of the 7 Christian virtues the order incorporated into their syncretic faith, and resurrection, the core promise of their religion that God would return from death or dormancy. 3 inner circles represent the past, present, and future, reflecting the order's belief that their God created linear time as a gift to humanity. At the center sits a design often described as resembling an eye, though interpretations vary about what this central element specifically represents. The circumference of the outer circles is inscribed with text in Rovasiras, an old Hungarian alphabet, interspersed with characters from the Elder Futhark, an ancient Nordic runic system. This linguistic mixture reflects the order's syncretic nature, drawing from multiple cultural traditions to create something uniquely their own. Specific runes in the design include Tiwaz, resembling an arrow, symbolizing the Norse god of war Tyr, and meant to bring fortune in battle. Another rune, Wunjo, appears similar to the letter P and traditionally brings joy, prosperity, and relief from troubles. When translated, these runes describe the order's manifesto and sacred history. The text speaks of gifts given to the sun and God's birth from these offerings, reflecting the creation mythology where suffering prayers created the deity. It continues by describing the deeds God performed, specifically granting mortality and creating linear time. Finally, it explicitly states the Order's ultimate goal of rebirthing God into the world. The inclusion of multiple alphabets and linguistic traditions suggests the Order saw themselves as heirs to numerous spiritual lineages, unifying ancient wisdom from cultures across Europe and incorporating it into their American cult. Various symbols within the halo of the sun relate to 8 natural elements that formed the foundation of the Order's cosmology. 3 main elements were steel, blood, and light. 5 lesser elements were fire, air, water, earth, and wood. Each element held specific meaning in the Order's rituals and connected to different aspects of their theology. Fire represented purification and transformation through suffering. Blood represented the life force that could be offered in sacrifice. Light represented divine revelation and truth, while the other elements connected to the natural world and the materials through which rituals could be conducted. The color of the halo of the sun carried specific meaning. Traditionally, the symbol was drawn in red, the sacred color associated with blood, life force, and divine power. Black was also acceptable for certain contexts, possibly representing death, the void from which God would return, or the other world itself. However, drawing the halo of the sun in blue or yellow reversed its meaning entirely, transforming it from a symbol of God's blessing into a curse against the deity. This inverted halo was strictly forbidden by the Order, considered a blasphemous act that could potentially hinder or prevent God's return. The strictness of this prohibition reveals important information about the Order's understanding of their own symbols. They believed the halo of the sun was not merely representational, but actively powerful, a sigil that, when properly drawn and displayed, could actually influence reality. The symbol functioned as a magical tool, channeling spiritual energy and creating sacred space where the Order's rituals would be more effective. The presence of the halo in ritual spaces was not decorative, but essential, marking locations where the boundary between the human world and the divine realm grew thin enough for the Order's work to proceed. The symbol appeared throughout Silent Hill in locations significant to the Order's history and activities. In the Green Lion Antiques shop, Travis Grady found himself standing within a massive halo of the sun drawn on the floor during the final confrontation in Silent Hill Origins, surrounded by cultists conducting their rituals. In Silent Hill 3, Heather Mason encountered the symbol repeatedly, and the game established that it served as save points. This mechanical use of the symbol tied to resurrection and rebirth reinforced the theological connection between the halo, divine power, and the cycle of death and return that defined the Order's beliefs. The halo of the sun appeared on numerous Order artifacts and sacred objects. The crested medallion, a key item in multiple games, featured the symbol prominently. The holes through which Henry Townsend traveled in Silent Hill 4 resembled halos of the sun, suggesting that even the architecture of the Otherworld itself bore the imprint of the Order's symbolism. The save point in Silent Hill Homecoming showed a simplified version with only the 3 inner circles, maintaining the connection to past, present, and future even in this reduced form. The widespread presence of the halo of the sun throughout Silent Hill demonstrates the depth of the order's influence over the town. The symbol was not confined to churches or ritual chambers, but appeared in schools, hospitals, antique shops, and various other locations that had been touched by the cult's activities. This ubiquity served multiple purposes. It marked territory the order considered theirs. It created networks of sacred space throughout Silent Hill, where their power was strongest, and it functioned as a constant reminder to both cultists and non-believers that the order's presence was inescapable. The physical representation of the halo also appeared in the order's interpretation of halos around holy figures. In sacred texts and artwork found in the chapel in Silent Hill 3, images of Alessa Gillespie show her with a halo around her head, marking her as the chosen vessel for God's return. This traditional Christian symbol was recontextualized within the order's theology, transforming from a representation of holiness into a literal indicator that this person carried divine essence. The halo was not metaphorical, but real, a visible manifestation of the sacred role the person played in the order's apocalyptic plans. Beyond its drug trafficking operations, the order maintained numerous sacred artifacts and ritual objects that played crucial roles in their ceremonies and belief system. These objects ranged from indigenous artifacts they appropriated from the native peoples they displaced to items they created specifically for their rituals. Understanding these artifacts provides insight into the practical mechanics of how the order conducted their ceremonies and attempted to manipulate spiritual forces. The fluoros stood as one of the most important ritual objects in the order's arsenal. This device, appearing as a cube-shaped puzzle box made of metal, functioned as a spiritual cage capable of temporarily binding divine or demonic entities. The name fluoros derives from demonology, where it refers to a powerful demon, suggesting the order viewed the device as connected to infernal powers. In practice, Dahlia Gillespie used the fluoros to attempt to control Alessa's psychic powers during the immolation ritual, believing she could bind the divine essence and force it to remain within her daughter's body as it grew toward birth. The white chrism represented another essential ritual component. This substance appeared as a white oil or ointment used in anointing rituals and possibly as a component in the more complex ceremonies the order conducted. The word chrism traditionally refers to consecrated oil used in Christian sacraments, but the order's version likely contained white Claudia extract or other psychoactive substances, transforming a traditional religious anointing into something that would directly alter consciousness. Evidence from Silent Hill 4 shows the white chrism stored alongside other ritual objects in the hidden chamber where Walter Sullivan preserved his body after completing the ritual of the Holy Assumption. The obsidian goblet, also called the Black Cup in some order texts, served as a ceremonial vessel for ritual offerings. Made from dark volcanic glass, the goblet appeared in references to the 21 Sacraments, where it was listed among the sacred objects required for the descent of the Holy Mother. The black color connected to void, darkness, and the primordial chaos from which God was born, while the material itself, obsidian, forms through volcanic processes involving intense heat and pressure, perhaps symbolizing transformation through suffering. The order likely used this goblet to collect and offer blood from sacrificial victims, containing the life force within a vessel sacred enough to make the offering acceptable to their deity. The seal of Metatron represented a powerful protective symbol that could actually oppose the order's god. This seal appeared as a complex geometric pattern different from the halo of the sun, and the order sometimes referred to it derogatorily as the Mark of Samael, suggesting it was associated with demonic forces that opposed their deity. In Silent Hill 3, the seal played a crucial role in the final confrontation, with Vincent Smith urging Heather Mason to use it to prevent God's birth. Claudia Wolf dismissed the seal as meaningless, a piece of junk that could not actually stop God's return, but her dismissal may have been false bravado rather than accurate theological understanding. Leonard Woolf served as the protector of the seal of Metatron, keeping it hidden in the depths of Brookhaven Hospital, where he had transformed into a monstrous form through his connection to the Order's power. His specific duty to guard this seal suggests the Order recognized it as genuinely dangerous to their plans, requiring a dedicated guardian who would prevent outsiders from accessing it. The seal's power apparently derived from preventing or reversing the spiritual pregnancy that carried God, making it a direct counter to the Order's primary method for resurrecting their deity. The Mother Stone, or Nakihona, served as the sect of the Holy Mother's most sacred object. This massive rock formation in the Silent Hill woods had been used by native peoples for ceremonies they believed allowed communication with deceased ancestors. The Order appropriated this stone, believing it could serve as the vessel into which God would descend if a properly prepared conjurer performed the correct ritual. The stone's massive size and natural formation gave it a power that human-made objects could not replicate, connecting the ritual directly to the land itself and the spiritual energy that had accumulated there over centuries. Various other objects appeared in the Order's rituals and sacred spaces. The ritual spears or lances found in Silent Hill 4 could damage Walter Sullivan's transformed body, suggesting they held specific power over those who had undergone the Order's most profound spiritual transformations. Candles marked ritual boundaries and were arranged in specific patterns during ceremonies, with different colored candles potentially serving different purposes. Robes in blood red identified members of the Valtiel sect, while other cultists wore various symbolic garments that indicated their rank, sect affiliation, and role in rituals. The most disturbing artifacts were those created from human remains. Evidence suggests the Order removed the hearts of Walter Sullivan's first 10 victims and preserved them for use in his ritual. These organs were found stored in a refrigerator in room 302's hidden chamber, macabre trophies that also served as essential components for the ceremony. The practice of removing and preserving organs appeared in other Order activities as well, transforming murder into sacred butchery where every part of the victim could potentially serve some theological purpose. At the heart of all the Order's activities, theological debates, and horrific rituals stood one central figure whose suffering would shape the entire town of Silent Hill for decades. Alessa Gillespie was born in 1976 to Dahlia Gillespie, high priestess of the sect of the Holy Woman, and a fanatic whose faith knew no limits or mercy. From the moment of Alessa's birth, Dahlia recognized that her daughter possessed extraordinary psychic abilities, gifts that made her the perfect vessel for the Order's most important work. Rather than protecting her child or helping her develop these abilities safely, Dahlia saw Alessa as a tool, the means by which God would finally return to the world. Alessa's childhood was marked by systematic abuse, designed to test and develop her powers while simultaneously breaking her will to resist. Dahlia subjected her daughter to psychological torture, locking her in the attic of their home when she refused to pray or showed insufficient devotion. The child endured beatings, starvation, and constant indoctrination in the Order's theology. Dahlia told Alessa that her suffering was sacred, that the pain she endured brought her closer to God, and that she should be grateful for the holy purpose her mother had chosen for her. The abuse was not random cruelty, but calculated methodology, each punishment designed to shape Alessa into someone who could serve as God's vessel while being too broken to effectively resist. Despite the abuse, or perhaps because of it, Alessa developed a fierce will to survive and a desperate desire to escape her mother's control. She formed one close friendship with Claudia Wolf, another child being raised in the Order who suffered similar abuse from her father, Leonard. The two girls found solace in each other's company, playing together when they could, and providing each other with the only kindness either experienced during their childhood years. Claudia looked up to Alessa, seeing her as blessed and chosen by God, genuinely believing that Alessa's destiny was holy. Alessa, for her part, loved Claudia like a sister, seeing in her the only person who truly understood what it meant to suffer under the Order's faith. By 1987, when Alessa was 7 years old, Dahlia decided the time had come to use her daughter for the immolation ritual. The exact details of what occurred that night remain somewhat unclear, but the general sequence of events has been established through various accounts. Dahlia brought Alessa to their home and prepared the second-floor room for the ceremony. She drew the halo of the sun around her daughter, placed sacred candles in the ritual configuration, and began the incantation that would impregnate Alessa with God's essence. 3 indigenous ritualists, whose identity remains unknown, participated in the ceremony, suggesting Dahlia sought to connect the ritual to the native practices that predated the Order's existence. The impregnation process involved setting Alessa on fire. Whether Dahlia doused her daughter in accelerant, or whether the ritual itself caused spontaneous combustion, is unclear, but flames engulfed the child, burning with an intensity that should have killed her within moments. Alessa's screams as she burned echoed through the Gillespie house and out into the surrounding neighborhood. A truck driver named Travis Grady, passing through Silent Hill on his route, heard the screams and saw smoke. Despite Alessa's psychic projection telling him to let her burn, to let her die and escape the horror of what was happening, Travis broke into the burning house and pulled the charred body outside. The fire was eventually ruled an accident, officially attributed to an old boiler in the Gillespie house. This explanation satisfied most residents of Silent Hill. Though some suspected darker truths, Dahlia made a show of being devastated by her daughter's injuries, playing the role of the distraught mother. Behind this facade, she was furious that the ritual had been interrupted before completion. The divine impregnation had occurred. God's essence now resided in Alessa's body, but the process was incomplete. Rather than accepting this failure, Dahlia immediately began working to salvage the situation. Alessa had sustained fourth-degree burns across most of her body. These burns destroyed skin, muscle, and in some cases reached bone. A normal child would have died within hours or days from the trauma, infection, and organ failure caused by such extensive burning. But Alessa was not normal. Her psychic abilities, amplified by the divine presence growing within her, refused to let her die. Dahlia further ensured her daughter's survival by casting a magical incantation, a binding spell that prevented Alessa from dying no matter how much she suffered. Dr. Michael Kaufman, director of Alchemilla Hospital and an associate of the order, took custody of Alessa's body. She was placed in a hidden room in the hospital's basement, kept in complete secrecy from the staff and public. Dahlia visited regularly to maintain the spell that kept her daughter alive, while the nurse Lisa Garland, addicted to PTV and blackmailed by Kaufman, provided basic medical care. No effort was made to heal Alessa's burns or reduce her pain. The agony was essential to the order's plan, feeding and strengthening the divine essence, gestating within her ruined body. For 7 years, Alessa existed in this state, unable to move, covered in bandages that concealed the full extent of her disfigurement. She lay in that basement room, experiencing constant, unbearable pain. Her psychic powers grew stronger, expanding outward and affecting the reality around her. The Otherworld, Silent Hill's nightmare dimension, did not exist before Alessa's immolation. It was created by her suffering, her hatred, and her desperate desire to escape the torment she endured. Her nightmares, her memories of abuse, her fear and anger all bled into reality, transforming Silent Hill into a reflection of her internal agony. But Alessa was not powerless despite her immobilized body. Using the psychic abilities that had made her valuable to her mother in the first place, she found a way to resist. Her soul split in two, with one half remaining trapped in her burned body, while the other half escaped, forming itself into an infant that appeared on a roadside near Silent Hill. Harry Mason and his wife Jody, driving past, discovered this baby. Jody was dying, and finding this child seemed like a miracle, a gift in their darkest hour. They named the baby Cheryl and raised her as their daughter, never knowing her true origin. This division of Alessa's soul accomplished several things. It prevented God from being born because only half of the divine essence remained in Alessa's body, not enough to complete the birthing process. It gave Alessa hope, knowing that at least part of her was free and living a normal life with a father who actually loved her. And it set in motion a plan. Throughout Cheryl's childhood, Alessa used her psychic connection to her other half to call Cheryl back to Silent Hill. Dahlia recognized this as well and cast a summoning spell to enhance the pull. Both mother and daughter wanted the soul halves reunited, but for very different purposes. Dahlia wanted to complete the ritual and birth God. Alessa wanted to reunite, so that together the two halves could destroy themselves, the town, and the divine essence, denying her mother the victory she sought. In 1994, 7 years after the immolation, Harry Mason returned to Silent Hill with his adopted daughter Cheryl. The moment they entered the town, Alessa's power fully manifested, transforming Silent Hill into the Otherworld. What followed was a desperate struggle between Dahlia's determination to complete the ritual and Alessa's equally desperate attempt to prevent it. In the end, Harry managed to prevent the full birth of God, though it cost him his daughter, Cheryl. From the ashes of this confrontation, Alessa gave Harry a gift, a newborn baby, the reincarnation of both soul halves finally united and freed from the divine parasite. Harry named this child Heather and spent the next 17 years hiding her from the Order, trying to give her a normal life. After Dahlia's death in the events of the first Silent Hill game, the Order fell into disarray. The sect of the Holy Woman had lost its leader, the immolation ritual had failed, and God remained unborn despite decades of preparation. For approximately 10 years, the cult remained fragmented and inactive. Some members drifted away, others maintained their faith privately while waiting for new leadership to emerge. The town itself began to recover somewhat, though the damage Alessa's psychic powers had inflicted on the fabric of reality never fully healed. Silent Hill would always bear the scars of what the Order had done, the boundary between worlds permanently weakened by 7 years of a burned child's nightmares bleeding into physical space. The revival came through two individuals. Vincent Smith provided the financial resources and organizational skills necessary to rebuild the Order's infrastructure. As a priest in the sect of the Holy Woman, Vincent understood the cult's structure and theology, but evidence suggests his true motivations were more mercenary than spiritual. He saw the Order as a vehicle for accumulating power and wealth, using the appearance of faith to manipulate true believers while maintaining his own comfortable position. Vincent restructured the cult to be more sustainable and efficient, establishing better funding sources and recruiting new members systematically rather than relying on the haphazard methods of the past. Claudia Wolf became the new high priestess, assuming Dahlia's former position while bringing her own theological perspective to the role. Claudia had never stopped believing, despite the Order's decade of inactivity. She had spent those years reflecting on what went wrong with Dahlia's approach and developing her own understanding of how God should properly be born. Where Dahlia had focused on pain and suffering, believing that divine essence grew stronger through the vessel's physical agony, Claudia concluded that the approach was incomplete. God needed to be born from hatred rather than mere pain, from a soul so consumed with rage and despair that the deity emerging from that darkness would truly understand humanity's suffering and create a paradise that addressed the deepest sources of anguish. This theological refinement reflected Claudia's own traumatic childhood. Leonard Woolf, her father, had been a fanatical member of the Order who beat his daughter whenever he believed she showed insufficient faith or committed any act he considered blasphemous. The abuse was relentless and severe, leaving Claudia with deep psychological scars and an overwhelming desire to create a world where no one would have to suffer as she had. Her faith was not cynical like Vincent's, but rather desperately sincere. She truly believed that birthing God and bringing about paradise would end all suffering, not just her own, but everyone's. In her mind, any action taken toward this goal was justified because the ultimate result would be the elimination of all pain forever. Claudia's target was obvious from the moment she learned that Alessa had been reborn. Harry Mason, the man who had interfered with the Order's ritual 17 years earlier, had hidden Alessa's reincarnation and given her a normal life. To Claudia, this was not kindness, but kidnapping. She saw Harry as the man who stole her childhood friend, who prevented God's birth and doomed humanity to continued suffering. Finding Alessa became Claudia's obsession, and she devoted significant Order resources to locating the girl Harry had named Heather. By 2001, 17 years after the first game's events, Claudia had located Heather Mason living a normal life with her father in a city far from Silent Hill. Heather was now a teenager, unaware of her true origin or the divine essence that had once resided within her previous incarnation. Claudia began planning carefully. Simply kidnapping Heather would not work because the divine essence had been destroyed when Alessa split her soul and reincarnated. To birth God, Heather would need to be impregnated with the divine seed again. And for that impregnation to successfully take root and grow, Heather needed to be in the proper psychological state. She needed to be filled with hatred. Claudia orchestrated the murder of Harry Mason with cold calculation. She dispatched a creature called the Missionary, a human cultist who had transformed into a monstrous form through exposure to the Order's power. The Missionary killed Harry in his apartment, leaving his corpse for Heather to discover. The murder served multiple purposes. It eliminated the man who had hidden Alessa from the Order for 17 years. It filled Heather with the rage and hatred Claudia believed was necessary for properly gestating God. And it ensured Heather would come to Silent Hill seeking revenge, walking willingly into the Order's grasp. When Heather discovered her father's body, the trauma broke something inside her. The carefully constructed normal life Harry had built for her shattered in an instant. The memories of her previous life as Alessa came flooding back, along with all the pain, fear, and anger she had endured. Combined with her grief and fury over Harry's murder, this created exactly the psychological state Claudia sought. The divine essence, which had remained dormant in Heather's reincarnated form, awakened and began to grow, feeding on her hatred, just as it had once fed on Alessa's pain. Heather, accompanied by Douglas Cartland, a private investigator who had been hired by Claudia but switched sides upon witnessing the Order's cruelty, traveled to Silent Hill. The town's Otherworld manifested around her, responding to her presence and the divine essence she carried. As she moved through the nightmare landscape, Heather encountered various Order members and learned the full truth of what had been done to her previous incarnation. The journey transformed from one of revenge into something more complex, a struggle to understand her own nature and decide what kind of person she wanted to be. The final confrontation occurred in the Order's chapel, a sacred space where multiple timelines and realities seemed to converge. Vincent Smith attempted to help Heather by suggesting she use the seal of Metatron to prevent God's birth. Claudia dismissed this suggestion, claiming the seal was powerless, but her desperation suggested otherwise. Before the debate could be resolved, Claudia stabbed Vincent, killing him because his cynicism and attempts to interfere had finally become intolerable to her fanatical faith. Heather felt the divine essence preparing to birth, the entity inside her ready to emerge and begin the apocalypse Claudia believed would cleanse the world. But Harry had prepared for this possibility. Years earlier, he had given Heather a necklace containing a pill of aglaophotis, a substance derived from white Claudia, but processed to repel demons and spiritual parasites rather than induce visions. Remembering her father's final gift, Heather swallowed the pill. The aglaophotis worked exactly as Harry intended, causing Heather to vomit up the fetal form of God as the substance purged the divine essence from her body. The tiny, premature deity lay on the floor, vulnerable and incomplete. Heather moved to destroy it, to stomp the life from this thing that had caused so much suffering across decades. Claudia, in an act of pure desperation, snatched up the fetus and swallowed it. Her logic was twisted but sincere. If Heather would not or could not complete the birthing, then Claudia herself would volunteer. She would bear the divine essence in her own body and complete the work that Dahlia had started with Alessa. The entity that emerged from Claudia was not the compassionate mother the Order had prophesied. It was a malformed, incomplete abomination, a god born from the wrong vessel without proper preparation, its form reflecting the chaos of its rushed and desperate creation. This flawed deity killed Claudia in the process of being born, tearing her apart from the inside. Heather then fought and destroyed this false god, ending the sect of the Holy Woman's centuries-long attempt to resurrect their deity. With Claudia and Vincent dead, and Douglas Cartland working to expose the Order's crimes to authorities, the sect effectively ceased to exist. While the sect of the Holy Woman pursued its immolation rituals and the Shepherd's Glen splinter group maintained their blood pact, the sect of the Holy Mother created perhaps the most tragic figure in Silent Hill's history through their systematic destruction of an abandoned child's psyche. Walter Sullivan entered the world unwanted, an infant left in room 302 of the South Ashfield Heights apartment building. His abandonment was likely not random, but rather the result of a desperate mother fleeing an abusive father who refused to let her take the child with her. The infant lay in that room until the building's superintendent discovered him and called authorities. Social services placed the baby in the Wish House Orphanage, delivering him directly into the Order's hands. From his earliest memories, Walter existed in a state of spiritual and psychological manipulation. The priests and caretakers at Wish House recognized that a child with no family connections, no one who would look for him, represented perfect raw material for their purposes. They raised him in the Order's theology, teaching him that suffering was holy, that the world beyond Wish House was corrupt and dangerous, and that his greatest purpose in life would be to serve God's return. More specifically, they taught him about the 21 Sacraments for the descent of the Holy Mother, a ritual that required the murder of 21 people in specific circumstances to create the conditions for God to descend into a sacred object. The priests at Wish House, particularly George Roston and Jimmy Stone, subjected Walter to physical and psychological abuse throughout his childhood. This treatment was not random cruelty, but deliberate methodology designed to break his will and make him absolutely obedient to the order's instructions. They beat him when he showed independent thought, isolated him when he formed friendships with other children, and constantly reinforced that his only value lay in eventually completing the sacred task they had chosen for him. The abuse was justified theologically as necessary discipline, spiritual training that would prepare Walter for the tremendous responsibility of becoming a conjurer. Despite the horror of his existence at Wish House, or perhaps because of it, Walter developed a powerful need for maternal love and connection. The priests exploited this need ruthlessly. Dahlia Gillespie, visiting Wish House during her time as High Priestess, told Walter about where he had been found. She explained that he had been abandoned in room 302, but she reframed this abandonment in terms Walter's desperate psyche could accept. The room itself, she told him, was his mother in a spiritual sense. The first thing he saw after being born was that room, and therefore it had imprinted on his soul as the source of safety and love. His mother had not abandoned him, but rather had placed him in her care, and she was waiting for him still, sleeping in that room, ready to awaken when he proved himself worthy. This psychological manipulation gave Walter something to cling to, a goal that justified all the suffering he endured. If he completed the 21 sacraments, performing the ritual murders correctly, and meeting all the theological requirements, then his mother would awaken. He would be able to return to room 302 and experience the love and safety he had been denied throughout his childhood. The promise was entirely false, a lie designed to motivate Walter to commit the murders the order needed for their ritual. But Walter believed it with absolute conviction because the alternative, accepting that he was truly alone and unloved, was psychologically unbearable. Walter left Wish House as a young adult of 18 years old, moving to Pleasant River, a town near Silent Hill. For a while, he attempted to live a normal life, attending university and trying to integrate into society beyond the order's direct control. But the years of indoctrination and abuse had left him fundamentally damaged. He felt perpetual resentment and bitterness toward the world, seeing other people as enemies or obstacles rather than potential connections. His social skills had been deliberately stunted by his upbringing, making it nearly impossible to form healthy relationships. He remained obsessed with the idea of returning to his mother, of completing the task that would finally earn him the love he craved. At some point during Walter's years away from Wish House, the order performed a ritual that placed the entity Valtiel into Walter's unconscious mind. This spiritual possession gave Walter abilities he had not possessed before, including the power to continue existing after death and the capacity to create entire worlds within the Otherworld. More importantly, it gave him the violence necessary to actually commit the murders. Without Valtiel's influence, Walter might never have been capable of killing despite his theological training. With the angel's presence in his psyche, providing both power and pushing him toward action. Walter became capable of acts that would horrify even himself once they were complete. In 2000, when Walter was 24 years old, he began the first phase of the 21 Sacraments. Over 10 consecutive days, he murdered 10 people, removing their hearts and carving numbers into their bodies. Each murder corresponded to a specific theme required by the ritual: gloom, despair, temptation, source, watchfulness, seduction, and others drawn from the order's sacred texts describing the ceremony. Walter selected his victims based on how well they fit these themes, choosing people whose lives or personalities aligned with the required symbolism. The victims included Andrew DeSalvo, a security guard at Wish House who had abused Walter and the other children there. His murder represented revenge, one of the permitted themes. Victim 5 and 6 were twin children, Billy and Miriam Locane, representing youth or innocence. Their murders were particularly brutal, with Billy killed by axe blows and Miriam dismembered. The 8th victim was William Gregory, an elderly clockmaker who represented age and the passage of time. The 9th was Eric Walsh, a bartender who represented just a normal person going about their life. The 10th was Robert Pierce, whose role in Walter's design remains less clear. After completing these 10 murders, Walter was captured by authorities. The police found evidence linking him to the crimes, though they did not understand the ritualistic nature of the killings or the theological significance of the removed hearts and carved numbers. Walter was imprisoned awaiting trial, but he never faced judgment from the human justice system. Instead, he performed the 11th sacrament, the ritual of the Holy Assumption, by stabbing himself in the neck with a spoon, severing his carotid artery. The suicide was slow and painful, but it accomplished exactly what Walter intended. His soul was released from his body, while that body remained preserved through mysterious means, and he gained the power to continue the ritual as a ghost. Walter's corpse was buried in an unmarked grave near Wish House, but the body did not remain there. Whether Walter's spirit moved it or whether order members retrieved it is unclear, but the corpse eventually ended up in the hidden chamber in room 302, surrounded by ritual objects including the white chrism, the obsidian goblet, and the 10 preserved hearts from his initial victims. The body underwent a transformation, becoming partially mummified and marked with the numbers 11 and 21 carved into the feet, indicating Walter's dual role as both victim and perpetrator in his own ritual. For 7 years, Walter existed as a spirit, inhabiting his own otherworld and preparing for the second phase of the 21 Sacraments. This otherworld was entirely his creation, reflecting his memories of Wish House, his obsession with room 302, and his fractured understanding of reality, shaped by years of abuse. In 2007, he resumed killing. These victims did not have their hearts removed because Walter no longer possessed a physical body capable of such surgery. Instead, he marked them with numbers and themes, continuing the ritual from beyond death. Victim 12 was Peter Walls, a drug addict representing void or emptiness. Victim 13 was Sharon Blake, drowned in the woods near Silent Hill, representing darkness. Victim 14 was Toby Archbold, the priest who ran Wish House and had fled to Mexico hoping to escape Walter's reach. Victim 15 was Joseph Schreiber, the journalist whose investigations into the order made him aware of Walter's ritual but unable to stop it. The remaining sacraments required specific individuals who Walter had been preparing throughout the entire ritual. Henry Townsend, the current tenant of room 302, was designated as the receiver of wisdom. Eileen Galvin, a neighbor who showed Walter kindness, was designated as the Mother Reborn, though whether this meant she would literally become Walter's mother or simply serve as a symbolic representation is unclear. Walter stalked them through multiple otherworld dimensions, attempting to complete the ceremony that would, he believed, finally awaken his mother and allow him to return home. In the end, Henry managed to destroy Walter's transformed body using the sacred spears and Walter's own preserved umbilical cord, items that held power over Walter's particular form of spiritual existence. Walter's soul was defeated, the 21 sacraments remained incomplete, and room 302 did not transform into the mother he sought. The ritual's failure marked the effective end of the sect of the Holy Mother, as Walter's killings had eliminated the sect's leadership, including both Jimmy Stone and George Roston. Walter Sullivan's story stands as perhaps the most tragic in Silent Hill's history. A child destroyed by the Order's beliefs and transformed into a monster who genuinely believed he was pursuing love. The Order's influence extended beyond their intentional actions into the very fabric of reality surrounding Silent Hill. The cult's rituals, particularly the immolation of Alessa Gillespie and the subsequent 7 years of her suffering, fundamentally altered the nature of the town and weakened the boundary between the normal world and the nightmarish dimension that would become known as the Otherworld. Understanding this impact requires examining how the Order's practices actually affected reality and created the conditions that define Silent Hill across all the games. Before Alessa's immolation in 1990, Silent Hill was simply a small town with a dark history and unusual spiritual properties. The native peoples had recognized these properties and incorporated them into their beliefs, and the Order had built their theology partly around the understanding that this location possessed unique characteristics. But the town itself remained relatively normal in its physical manifestation. Residents went about their daily lives. Tourists visited the lake and enjoyed the resort amenities. And while strange events occasionally occurred, reality remained fundamentally stable. Alessa's suffering changed everything. Her psychic abilities, amplified by the divine essence growing within her, and the constant agony she endured, bled outward from the basement room where she lay imprisoned. Her nightmares became real. Her memories manifested physically, and her desperate desire to escape transformed the space around her. Initially, these effects remained localized around Alchemilla Hospital and perhaps radiated outward a short distance. But as 7 years passed and Alessa's power grew stronger through continued suffering, the affected area expanded until it encompassed the entire town and even began reaching into neighboring communities. The Otherworld existed simultaneously with normal reality, separated by a boundary that grew increasingly thin and permeable. In some locations, and under certain conditions. This boundary collapsed entirely, causing reality to shift between the normal world and the nightmare dimension without warning. The transition was often signaled by the sound of air raid sirens, a detail that possibly reflected Alessa's memories or fears related to danger and alarm. When the sirens sounded, the world transformed. Buildings decayed into rust and blood, monsters appeared in the streets, and the rules of physics and logic broke down. The specific manifestation of the otherworld varied depending on who encountered it. Suggest dreams might be merely epiphenomena, byproducts of the brain's nighttime activity without inherent meaning or purpose. Regardless of their ultimate purpose, dreams clearly involve active processing of meaningful personal content rather than random neural noise, as evidenced by the fact that dream content correlates with waking concerns and experiences. Studies have found that people who are learning new skills dream about those skills. People going through stressful experiences dream about stress-related themes, and that dream deprivation, accomplished by waking people whenever they enter REM sleep, leads to psychological distress, increased anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and in extreme cases, hallucinations during waking hours. The phenomenon of recurring dreams, where the same dream or dream theme repeats over time, may represent the brain's attempt to process unresolved emotional issues or persistent concerns. And many people report that recurring dreams stop once they've addressed the underlying issue in their waking lives. The phenomenon of sleep talking or somniloquy occurs when you vocalize during sleep, ranging from incomprehensible sounds and mumbling to complete sentences and even entire conversations. And it can happen during any stage of sleep, though the content and characteristics differ depending on the stage. During non-REM sleep, sleep talking tends to be brief and simple, often just a few words, sounds, or short phrases, and the content is usually mundane and unrelated to complex dreams. During REM sleep, sleep talking can be more elaborate and may be connected to dream content, with people sometimes narrating their dreams or responding to dream characters as if having a conversation. Sleep talking is generally harmless and very common, with studies suggesting that up to 2/3 of people talk in their sleep at some point in their lives, though most episodes are so brief or quiet that they go unnoticed. Some people talk in their sleep frequently, even nightly, while others do so only occasionally during periods of stress, illness, or after drinking alcohol. The content of sleep talking is typically mundane and doesn't reliably reveal secrets or hidden truths, despite popular belief otherwise. People might recite grocery lists, comment on dream imagery, or say completely nonsensical things that have no meaning whatsoever. Sleep talking occurs because the normal suppression of vocal muscle activity during sleep is incomplete, allowing vocalization to occur even though you're unconscious and unaware of speaking. Interestingly, sleep talking can sometimes be triggered or influenced by external sounds, with a sleeping person incorporating sounds from their environment into their dreams and responding to them, creating the illusion of two-way communication, even though the sleeping person isn't actually conscious. In rare cases, sleep talking can be a symptom of more serious sleep disorders, particularly when activities but had become an active participant in supernatural events, drawing in those who carried guilt or suffering and reflecting their inner darkness back at them with physical reality. The physical town showed signs of this spiritual corruption. Buildings decayed at accelerated rates. Fog rolled in from the lake with unusual frequency and density. Electronic devices malfunctioned without clear cause. The population declined as residents moved away from what they sensed was an increasingly wrong place, even if they could not articulate what exactly felt so disturbing. Those who remained often displayed unusual psychology, either complete denial of the strangeness around them or an attraction to the darkness that suggested they were drawn to Silent Hill for reasons they did not fully understand. The Order's ultimate goal had been to birth God and bring about paradise through apocalyptic cleansing. They failed in this goal repeatedly, but they succeeded in corrupting an entire town, transforming it into a place where nightmares walked alongside people and where reality itself could no longer be trusted. This transformation persisted even after the cult's destruction, suggesting that the damage done by decades of their activities could not be easily reversed or healed. Silent Hill would remain haunted by the Order's legacy long after the last cultist died. By 2007, the Order as an organized force had effectively ceased to exist. The sect of the Holy Woman ended with Claudia Wolf's death in Silent Hill 3, its remaining members scattered and without leadership. The sect of the Holy Mother was destroyed by Walter Sullivan's killing spree, which eliminated the sect's key leadership. The sect of Valtiel similarly collapsed when Walter murdered both Jimmy Stone and George Roston. The Shepherd's Glen splinter group fell apart after Judge Margaret Holloway's death in Silent Hill Homecoming, with the breaking of the blood pact making the entire sect's purpose obsolete. Private investigator Douglas Cartland worked actively to expose the Order's crimes in the aftermath of the Third Game's events. His investigations brought to light the drug trafficking, the abuse at Wish House Orphanage, the murders connected to the cult, and enough evidence of their activities to ensure that law enforcement could no longer ignore or cover up what had been happening in Silent Hill for decades. The public exposure destroyed any remaining credibility the Order might have maintained and made it impossible for survivors to rebuild the organization openly. Yet, the question of whether the Order truly ended remains ambiguous. Cults rarely die completely, and the Order had existed in various forms for over 2 centuries. Evidence suggests that while the major sects and leadership structures collapsed, individual believers remained scattered throughout the region and possibly beyond. These survivors might continue practicing their faith in isolation or small groups, lacking the resources and organization to pursue the grand rituals of the past, but maintaining the core beliefs that defined the Order's theology. Toby Archbolt's flight to Mexico demonstrated that Order members had spread beyond Silent Hill's immediate area. The cult's drug trafficking operation likely connected them to criminal networks across the country. The possibility of international membership cannot be ruled out, particularly given the syncretic nature of the Order's theology and symbolism, which drew from multiple cultural traditions and might have appealed to believers in various nations. These scattered remnants might never reconstitute the Order as it existed at its peak, but they could continue as isolated cells, maintaining the faith while waiting for circumstances that might allow reorganization. The impact of the Order's legacy extended beyond the survival of individual believers. The town of Silent Hill itself remained permanently altered by decades of their rituals and the supernatural forces they had invoked or created. The Otherworld persisted even after Alessa's death and reincarnation, suggesting that the corrupted reality the Order had helped create could not simply be undone. Future visitors to Silent Hill would continue encountering manifestations of their own darkness, continue experiencing shifts into nightmare dimensions, continue facing monsters that reflected their deepest fears and guilt. The Order's theological ideas might also persist and spread in ways harder to track than organizational continuity. The belief that suffering is sacred, that pain brings spiritual enlightenment, that a corrupt world deserves destruction, and only the faithful will be saved, are unfortunately not unique to the Order. These ideas appear in various forms across multiple religious movements throughout history. Someone who learned the Order's teachings might carry those beliefs into other contexts, influencing new communities without explicitly claiming Order membership. The theological virus they represented could spread through cultural transmission, even as the cult that originally incubated those beliefs died out. The cult's physical infrastructure also left traces that might enable future revival. The sacred sites they used, from the ritual chamber beneath Shepherd's Glen, to the hidden rooms in Alchemilla Hospital, to the ruins of Wish House, remained physical locations that could theoretically be reactivated by future believers. The artifacts they created or collected, while many were likely destroyed or lost, might still exist in private collections or hidden caches. Someone discovering the obsidian goblet or a copy of the Order's sacred texts might attempt to resurrect the practices described there, creating a neo-Order movement based on recovered information. The example of Shepherd's Glen also demonstrated that the Order's reach extended into family lineages spanning generations. The Shepherds, Holloways, Bartletts, and Fitches maintained their blood pact for 150 years, suggesting that some families had built their entire identities around Order beliefs. Even after the pact's breaking and the destruction of the Shepherd's Glen sect, descendants of these families might retain elements of the faith or feel drawn to Silent Hill and its mysteries. Multi-generational cult membership creates psychological bonds that persist even after the organization itself collapses, and these bonds could serve as foundations for future reorganization. Perhaps most troublingly, the Order's core theological claim was never definitively disproven. Their God was never fully born, but Alessa did become pregnant with a divine or demonic entity, and that entity did partially manifest multiple times. Heather vomited up a fetus that, while it did not survive, represented something genuinely supernatural. The creature that emerged from Claudia was monstrous and imperfect, but it existed and possessed tremendous power before being destroyed. A believer examining these events could argue that the Order was correct about everything except the methodology, that their God was real and their rituals were on the right track, even if execution was flawed. This interpretation could motivate future attempts to complete what the original order started, possibly learning from past failures to develop more effective approaches. The order's story illustrates how spiritual corruption can persist across generations, how abuse and trauma perpetuate themselves through theological justification, and how suffering can be transformed into sacred practice by those willing to ignore basic human compassion in pursuit of transcendent goals. Though the order itself may have died, the darkness it represented and the questions it raised about the nature of divinity, suffering, and salvation continue to haunt the fog-shrouded streets of Silent Hill. The order believed they were bringing paradise through pain. They believed God required suffering to be born. They believed the world was corrupt and deserved cleansing fire. What they created instead was a legacy of trauma, a town transformed into nightmare, and the destruction of countless lives, including those of the children they claimed to be saving. Their failure to achieve their goals did not undo the damage they inflicted. The burned girl in the hospital basement, the abandoned boy who became a killer, the families forced to sacrifice their own children for false promises of protection. All these victims remained, their suffering real and irreversible, regardless of whether the order's theology was ultimately true. As we drift towards sleep tonight, consider what it means to believe so completely in a vision of the future that the present becomes acceptable to destroy in its pursuit. The order saw themselves as righteous, as necessary, as the only ones willing to do what had to be done. They were wrong, but their certainty never wavered, even as they burned children, manufactured drugs, murdered investigators, and corrupted everything they touched. The horror of Silent Hill stems not from the monsters in the fog, but from the humans who created those conditions while calling it holy work. May we rest knowing we would never become so certain of our righteousness that we could justify such cruelty in faith's name. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the theology and history of Silent Hill's most disturbing cult, I would love it if you could leave a like on this video. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you never miss another journey into the lore that helps us sleep. Until next time, dreamers, rest well, and may your nightmares remain safely fictional.